than other places I have been to. I sense I look a bit different here.
跟我以往去到的不同的地方，我今天看起来好像有一点不一样。
But thankfully, Paul said, we have all been clothed with Christ.
但是感谢主，我们是穿戴基督的人。
What a privilege for me to be with you today.
今天我深感荣幸，能够在这里与大家分享。
When Paul wrote the letter to the Philippians, he was in prison, and there was a lot of uncertainty in his life.
当保罗写这封书信的时候，给腓立比教会，他其实是在监狱当中，而且他生命有许多的不稳定。
Yet he was not too concerned about what happens to him.
他其实不关心自己正在发生什么事情，
He was concerned about what happens to the gospel.
但是他却关心福音。
In Philippians 1:27, he says, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ."
在腓立比书第1章第27节，他说：“只要你们行事为人与基督的福音相称。”
And then he says two things, what that looks like.
那他讲到2件的事情是怎么样的一个情况？
The first thing is that we need to stand firm in one spirit.
第一个是我们要同有一个心志。
And not just standing firm. The second thing is with one mind striving forward, side by side for the faith of the gospel.
我们要站立的稳，有同一个心志，为所信的福音齐心努力。
And this applies to our attitude towards the younger generation.
而这个也是我们在面对年轻的一代，我们要有的一个态度。
We have to stand together with them
我们要与他们站立在一起。
against all opposition in the spiritual realms.
当他们在属灵的层面遇到许多的攻击的时候，
This opposition can be intellectual, moral, or physical.
这个或许是来自知识、道德或者物理的一些的攻击、反对。
And not just stand together with them. We have to move forward with one mind.
不只是我们与他们站立在一起，我们要有同一个心志，与他们一同迈进。
He's talking about a oneness.
他是讲到同一的心志，
To move forward as one person.
如同一个人一同前行。
The word striving side by side, that has the idea of shared struggle.
齐心努力，我们可以说是分担重担和挣扎。
So to struggle together with young people and move forward as one person to bring others to the faith.
所以，当我们与年轻的一代，我们与他分享重担挣扎的时候，我们是与他们一同前行。
So regardless of our cultural barriers, there needs to be an intergenerational oneness that will make us an unstoppable force for the gospel.
所以，虽然我们在文化上有许多不同的阻碍，但是我们这个跨代的合一，在福音的工作里面，是一股不可阻挡、强大的力
That
量。
was the end of chapter 1, and then chapter 2, the first 11 verses, is an exposition on how we can foster this oneness.
那这是腓立比书1章的结束，但是在2章的时候，我们看到他如何的来说明这个合一。
Again, the burden behind the oneness is an evangelistic burden.
而这里所讲到的负担是福音的负担。
We are not going to look at all the verses, but we are going to look at 3 points.
我们不会看所有的经文，但我们会看3个重点。
In Philippians 2:3, he says, "But in humility, count others more significant than yourselves."
第2章第3节说：“只要存心谦卑，个人看别人比自己强。”
Now, because the gospel is absolute truth,
福音是绝对的真理，
truths that we need to submit to,
我们需要顺服真理。
for many young people in this generation, the gospel appears as an arrogant message.
在年轻的一代当中，福音似乎是一个傲气的福音。
However, if the arrogant message is coming to them by people who have gone below them,
如果这个所谓似乎很傲气的福音是以谦卑的人来传扬的话，
they are more open to embracing the gospel in their lives.
他们或许会更敞开的来接纳这个福音的合一。
So one way to approach the younger generation in humility is meeting them at their highest.
所以，其中一个很好的方式，就是在年轻一代他们的成就、他们的最高处，我们以谦卑的心来去亲近他们。
Sometimes we approach young people in arrogance, saying, I have so much to offer to you.
有时候我们会有点傲气的来对年轻的一代说：“我可以帮助你很多。”
But humility may be seeing what young people have to offer to
但是
us.
一颗谦卑的心，是让我们看到年轻的一代有什么样的能力来到帮助我们。
When Jesus met the Samaritan woman, he didn't say, "Hi, I'm Jesus. How can I help you?"
当主耶稣遇到撒玛利亚妇人的时候，他没有对这位妇人说：“你好，我是耶稣，我有什么可以帮助你的吗？”
He said, "Can you help me?"
但是主耶稣却对他说：“你可以帮助我吗？”
Jesus was breaking so many cultural barriers and treating her with high honor.
其实主耶稣突破了许多文化、社会、道德的障碍，他以尊荣待他。
In modern terms, it's like you are thirsty and you go and ask a beggar on the street for some water.
如果以现代的方式来说，就是当我们口渴的时候，我们去向一位乞丐来讨水喝。
The beggar is humble enough to ask us for water, but are we humble enough to ask the beggar for water?
乞丐他或许会很卑微的心来向我们要一杯水喝，但是我们是否同样能够以谦卑的心来向他讨水喝呢？
Jesus lifted her by humbly asking for help.
主耶稣尊荣他，谦卑的来向他讨水喝。
And then he spoke with authority and offered her ultimate soul satisfaction.
然后主耶稣以权柄来给他有这一个灵魂的得救。
In my organization, we try hard to honor young people.
在青年归主协会当中，我们要尊荣年轻人。
So when I meet a young person, I try hard to find something that the young person is good at that I am not.
当我遇到一位年轻人的时候，我会尝试的来去看到在他里面有什么的长处
A。strength in him that is a weakness in me.
在他里面是一个强处，但是我却是一个软弱的。
And often telling him, "Please, can you help me? Please, can you teach me this?"
我常常会对他说：“你可以帮助我吗？你可以教导我吗？”
If we can approach young people with such humility, then they will be ready to embrace the gospel.
如果我们愿意以这样谦卑的心来去亲近这些年轻人，他们会预备接受福音。
And when this young generation of young people are convinced the gospel is the most beautiful message in the world and that is the most urgent message in the world, they will give their lives for it.
当他们能够真的信任，并且看到这个年轻人看到这个福音是何等美好的一个信息的时候，他们一定也会愿意献上他们的生命来去传扬。
But first we must meet them at their highest.
但是首先，我们必须要以谦卑的心，在他们的最高处来到遇见他们。
And now we come to the second point. Philippians in 2:6, it says, Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant.
第二点，我们来看第2章6到7节，他本有神的形象，不以自己与神同等为强夺的，反倒虚己，取了奴仆的形象，成为人的样式。
The second point is approaching this young generation with the humility of a servant.
第二点就是以谦卑仆人的心态来去接近他们。
One day the disciples were talking about who is greater.
有一天，他们门徒正在讨论谁为大。
And then Jesus in Luke 22:27 says, "For who is greater? Is it the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves?"
在路加福音22章27节，主耶稣就说到：是谁为大？是坐席的呢？是服侍人的呢？
And Jesus answers the question. He says, "Is it not the one who reclines at the table?
不是坐席的为大吗？
But I am among you as one who serves."
然而我在你们中间如同服侍人
So
的。
Jesus is saying that he was like a waiter among us.
所以主耶稣是在说，我好像一个服务生在你们的当中。
My first point was lifting up young people by humbly asking them for help.
所以我第一点就是要尊荣年轻人，我们谦卑的来向他们寻求帮助。
My second point is humbly serving them.
我的第二点就是我们要以仆人的心态来到去服侍他们。
Jesus is redefining what greatness looks like.
主耶稣为谁为大重新的定义。
Greatness is in our ability to be like a waiter while the young generation is sitting around the table.
谁为大，这是我们的一个能力，像一个服务生一样，在我们年轻的人当中来服侍他
The
们。
waiter is often ignored and doesn't get much respect and honor in society.
通常一位服务生，他在服侍的当中，他是通常是被 被人没有被看到的，或者不被尊重的。
The waiter is usually ordered around.
他常常会被人家吩咐要做一些事情。
The waiter has one job, and that is to serve the honorable guests.
服务生他只有一个工作，一个责任，就是要来服侍尊荣的客
In 2
人。
Corinthians 4:5, Paul says, "For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus as Lord." That is our message. Jesus is Lord.
第二，在哥林多后书第4章第5节说到，我们原不是传自己，乃是传基督耶稣为主，这就是我们的目的。
But as for ourselves, we are your slaves for Jesus' sake.
但是我们自己却是因耶稣而做你们的仆人。
There are a couple of words in the New Testament for this word servant. One is doulos, and that means bond servant or slave.
在新约当中有提到仆人的一些原文，其中一个是 doulos， 就是奴隶的意思。
If you are a bond servant of people, then the people become like your master.
如果你是一个奴隶的话，等于说这些年轻人就是你的主人。
In my line of work, we work with young people and young leaders in their 20s and 30s.
在我的事工当中，我常常与20到30岁之间的年轻的人或者年轻的领袖。
Now I am their leader, and as their leader, I have to lead them, and leadership is important, especially for movements.
但我是他们的领袖，所以我要带领他们。特别是领导是非常重要的。
But as Bishop Hua Young one day told me, the New Testament doesn't make much of leadership or training leaders.
但有一天，华永长老对我说，新约当中其实没有许多领袖的训练，
It does make much of being a servant.
但是却有许多仆人的训
Now, if
练。
I'm their servant, then the young leaders become like my masters.
所以，如果我是仆人的话，这一些的年轻人就是我的主人。
I approach them as my master.
我来到他们面前，我是以仆人的心态。
The servant always has to work according to the schedule of the masters.
一个仆人要按着他的主人的时间表来去行事。
The first time I saw this was when my parents, they worked in the urban slums of Colombo through their church. And when my father and mother would go into one of these tiny houses, young people married in their 20s, they would go like servants.
我第一次看到这样的情况是，当我的父母他们进入到贫民区的时候，他们进入到一个非常小的一个家里面，就好像一个仆人一样。
My father has many qualifications, but when he goes into a home, he goes like a slave.
我的父亲是一个非常有学识的一位我的父亲，但是他进入家里的时候却像一个奴隶一样。
And these people think, oh, he's coming like a slave. Then we are like masters. We can use him.
所以房子里面的人就说他来好像一个仆人的形态，那我们可以来使用他。
And they used my parents.
他们真的就这样的来用我的父亲。
Whenever they had a need, they called my parents, and my parents had to be there for them.
只要他们有需要，他们就会联络我的父母，我父母就会去帮助他们。
In Matthew 5:5, Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek."
马太福音第5章第5节说：“温柔的人有福了。”
The meek are those who are used, but it doesn't break them.
温柔的人，他们是可以被人来使用，但是他们却不会破灭。
They don't say, "I have my rights."
他不会去问说：“我有这样的权利吗？”
They don't say it because they remember that they are slaves.
他们不会这样说，因为他们记得他是仆人。
After Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he said in John 13:14, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also have to wash one another's feet."
当主耶稣为他的门徒洗脚之后，在约翰福音第13章14节说：“我是你们的主，你们的夫子，尚且洗你们的脚，你们也当彼此洗脚。”
He longed for them to serve one another.
他希望他们能够彼此来服侍。
And I believe his burden was to create that oneness. In John 17, at the summit of his high priestly prayer, he pleads with the Father that they may become perfectly one.
他心里面的负担就是希望看到门徒能够合一，特别是在约翰福音17章他的祷告当中，他要看到这个合一，
So that the world may know that you have sent me.
这样这世界就会知道是你差派我来。
Jesus' burden for oneness was also an evangelistic burden.
主耶稣心中的负担要我们合一，同样也是福音的这个负担。
So may we become one with young people by serving them.
所以我们能够与年轻的一代合为一，能够一同的来服侍他们。
And the next point is in verse 7 of chapter 2, where it says that Jesus was born in the likeness of men, and he was found in human form.
下一个重点就是在第7节，反倒虚己，取了奴仆的形象，成为人的样式。
So the final point is embracing the frustration of steadfast commitment to young people.
所以第3个重点就是我们要承受挫败，我们要坚定委身服侍年轻的一代。
Once I was visiting a home in the high mountains of Sri Lanka, and there was a cattle shed there.
有一次我在斯里兰卡的高山，我去探访一个家庭，
And I went into the cattle shed, and I got the smells and the sounds.
我进到他们的牛圈当中，我闻到那个味道。
And I was thinking, could Jesus have been born in a place like this? The gospel doesn't say very clearly, but there seems to be some evidence.
虽然福音书没有很清楚的写到主耶稣是不是在这样的一个地方来降生，
How much Jesus let go right from day one, how much frustration he embraced to get close to us.
主耶稣需要舍弃多少，他需要放弃多少，从第一天开始，他要经历多少的这个挫败。
Paul also got close to the people he served.
保罗也一样这样的来亲近他所服侍的人。
In Acts 20, we have the only speech given to Christians in the book of Acts.
在使徒行传第20章，这是一段对着基督徒所讲的经文。
Where Paul, he calls the Ephesian elders together one last time, and he reminds them of the 3 years that he spent with them.
他来召集了以弗所的长老，这是最后一次，他要来在3年当中与他们一起。
In verse 20, 19, he said how he served with humility and tears.
在第20章第19节说到，他服侍主，他是凡事谦卑，眼中流泪。
We talked about approaching young people in humility.
我们说到，我们要以谦卑的心来亲近年轻的一代。
But what about these tears?
那我们是否流泪？
In verse 20, he said he was teaching in public and from house to house.
在第20节，他说到他在众人面前，在个人的家里教导。
So Paul was getting close to people.
所以保罗是亲近人的。
When we get close to young people, we end up shedding the tears of open-hearted identification with their struggles.
所以当我们亲近这些年轻的一代的时候，我们是流着泪，敞开心来与他们一同的分享挣扎。
A couple of years ago, there was a Muslim young man who I used to visit every week. I used to go and spend time with him.
在几年前，我有曾经每一个礼拜去探访一个穆斯林的年轻人。
Every week for about 3 hours, we had a lot of unhurried conversation and we used to play together.
每一个礼拜，我大概2-3个小时与他慢慢的畅谈。
We became the best of friends.
我们成为了好朋友。
One day I was in the USA and I got a call saying that this boy had jumped out of the bridge into the river to commit suicide.
有一天我在美国的时候，我接到一通电话说他从桥上跳下去，
But someone had jumped and rescued him.
但是有人跳下去救他起来。
Now, if I heard in the news that a young man had jumped, I will be sad, but I may not weep.
如果我只是普通的听到一位年轻人就是跳下水里的话，我可能只是会伤心，但我不会流
Or
泪。
if I hear in my church a young person in my church has jumped out of the bridge, I will be devastated, but I may not weep and weep and weep.
如果是我教会的一个年轻人遇到这个事情的话，我可能会很崩溃，但我不会一直流泪。
But because I had made myself vulnerable and got so close, I had to shed the tears of open-hearted identification, and I wept and wept and wept in front of my American friend.
但是因为我在这个年轻人的面前，我是非常脆弱和敞开，关系也是亲近的，所以我在美国的时候，我是敞开心，在人的面前不断的流泪。
In Acts 20, verse 31, again he uses the word tears.
第31节，我们看到他又流泪。
He said, remember that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears.
今年我3年之久，昼夜不住的流泪，劝诫你们个人。
Some of our leaders in the mountain cities of Sri Lanka are from extremely impoverished backgrounds.
在斯里兰卡，在高山非常 的高山的一个地方。
It's only when you go into their homes, use their dark outdoor toilets, sleep on the ground, spend hours in unhurried conversation, it's only then can you start teaching them with tears.
我进入到他们的家里，去到一个非常昏暗的一个厕所，或者睡在地上，或者与他们不急的来去分享的时候，我才可以开始流着泪的来教导他们。
Otherwise, I'll be a distant Bible teacher.
不然我是跟他们一个有距离的圣经教师。
But when we get close to people like our own children, then we shed tears. We shed tears for our own children, right?
我们为了我们自己的孩子来到流泪。
Tears that come when they suffer or disobey God or hurt you back.
当他们经历痛苦的时候，当他们不顺服神，或者当他们伤害我们的时候，我们是流着泪的。
Jesus was pulled from every side, crowds constantly pursuing him. Yet one of his great priorities was to spend time with his disciples.
众人常常会要来拖拉主耶稣，要来亲近主耶稣，但是主耶稣最大的一个重点就是要与他的门徒来亲近。
Hudson Taylor was 22 when he went to China, and he was into his third year, and dark clouds were looming above him.
戴德生22岁的时候去到中国，在他第3年服事的时候，他的生命像乌云笼罩一
His
样。
sending mission in UK stopped supporting him.
他的差会停止了对他的支持。
At the same time, he got a lot of criticism from fellow missionaries.
他也遭到其他宣教士的抨击。
And then he got a letter from his girlfriend in England saying that she didn't love him anymore.
他的女朋友在英国寄信给他说：“我不爱你了。”
And another letter asking him to stop certain work in in towns.
还有另外一封信来对他说：“你要停止某一些城市的宣教事工。”
He was devastated and was like on the verge of giving up.
他非常的崩溃，他几乎要放弃。
He wrote to his mother saying, "My heart is sad, 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 and I don't know what to do."
他写信跟他母亲说：“我非常的伤心，非常的伤心，我不知道应该怎么做。”
Right at that time, God gave Hudson Taylor a friend, William Burns, a Scottish man 20 years older than him.
在那个时候，神就赐给了戴德生一个朋友，他是苏格兰的一个大概比他年长20年一个苏格兰的宣教士，叫威廉伯恩斯。
And Burns just spent time with Hudson Taylor. I don't think he did ministry, but whenever Hudson Taylor would go somewhere, Burns would just tag along with him.
伯恩斯就是这样不断的陪伴戴德生。
A biographer said Burns saved Hudson Taylor from himself.
有一个传记作家说，伯恩斯拯救了戴德生。
Possibly because of Burns, Hudson Taylor didn't give up.
或许因为伯恩斯，戴德生他并没有放弃。
How important it is for older Christians to spend unhurried time with younger believers.
年长的基督徒，如果我们愿意花时间在年轻的基督徒当中，这是何等的重
You know, I
要。
have learned so much from our leaders in these mountain cities.
我从一些偏远的领袖，在斯里兰卡偏远的地方的领袖学习很多。
Their lives are not driven by time.
他们是没有时间限制的，
So they easily linger in the presence of God for hours.
他们可以花很长的时间来亲近主。
And strengthened by the steadfast love of God in their lives, they linger in the presence of people for hours.
所以神兼顾他们，让他们有这样的爱，能够长时间的围绕在人群当中。
Regardless how difficult the young people are,
不管这些的年轻人是多么的艰难，
such lingering produces security in young people.
但这样的陪伴使年轻人有安全感。
And these young people think, I have disappointed my leader so much, I have wounded my leader so much, yet he still wants to spend time with me.
这些年轻人或许会想说，我让我的领袖失望，我甚至伤害他们，但是他仍然愿意陪伴我。
What happens is that even the most broken, insecure young people start believing in steadfast love.
但是我们看到，因此有许多受伤的，甚至没有安全感的年轻人，开始相信坚定的爱。
Perhaps God loves me the same.
或许神也是如此的爱我，
And the result is they are not afraid to fail.
因此他们也不害怕失败，
And they end up attempting great things for the gospel.
他们就愿意为福音做更大的事。
Paul got so close to people.
保罗他是非常亲近人。
In Galatians 4, he says, "My little children, from whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you."
在加拉太书第4章19节说：“我小子啊，我为你们在受生产之苦，只等到基督成型在你们心里。”
And 1 Thessalonians 2:7, "But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children."
帖撒罗尼迦前书第2章第7节说：“只在你们中间存心温柔，如同母亲乳养自己的孩子。”
You cannot get closer than a nursing mother.
没有什么比母亲乳养孩子更亲密的。
So when we plan our week,
所以
how much time do we give to spending unhurried time with young people?
所以当我们在做每一个礼拜的计划的时候，我们有计划多少的时间要来亲近陪伴年轻
Sadly,
人？
discipleship today has been reduced to programs and events.
但是很可悲的，现在的门徒训练只剩下大会跟活动。
That is much easier than embracing the frustration of getting close to people and making yourself vulnerable.
因为似乎这样比真实的展现自己脆弱的一面来得更加的简单。
But this is authentic ministry.
但是这是一个真实的事工。
Patrick Fung said how authenticity demands vulnerability. Authenticity goes beyond competency.
冯哈流医生曾经这样子说过，就是真实性其实是超越能力的，真实性在领导、在教导、在辅导当中。
Competency shows our skill and our ability to lead, to preach, to teach, to counsel. But authenticity shows our vulnerability. I'm willing to be vulnerable, to be hurt, to carry wounds.
我们或许有能力能够来领导、来教导、来辅导，但是当我们真实的来敞开自己，我们愿意成为脆弱，我们经历伤害，真实的让人看到我们。
Authentic commitment demands frustration.
真正的委身是会经历挫败的。
But the postmodern mood of the day, driven by maybe Western ideas, teach us to be committed to our feelings.
但是后现代的一个教导，常常都或者一个西方的教导，常常都对我们说，我们要对自己的感受负责任。
And so we shy away from the negative feelings that come from when you get close to people.
所以我们常常会有负面的这种的情绪，把自己关闭起来。
When we get close, frustration sets in. And then we want to give up on people, whether it's our disciple, our church, our spouse.
当我们越亲近人的时候，或许我们就会经历更大的挫败，因此我们或许就会放弃不与他们来亲近，或者是我们的门徒、我们的团队。
Yet in his commitment to us, Jesus embraced the frustration and came close to us.
但是主耶稣却愿意经历这样的挫败，为的是要来亲
And
近
he
我们。
embraced this frustration all the way to the cross.
而且他甚至一直带着这样的一个挫败来到十
We
字架的前
constantly
面。
disappoint him, we constantly rebel against him, but he constantly forgives us and uses us.
我们常常让主耶稣失望，我们甚至没有遵照他的意思，但是他却仍然来赦免我们，他却使用我们。
I think we are afraid to get close to young people or even young leaders because of the frustration it involves.
有时候我们害怕会经历挫败，所以我们不敢来到亲近这些年轻人。
Especially when they wound us or don't honor us or take us for granted.
特别是当他们伤害我们的时候，或者不尊荣我们的时候。
John 10, Jesus talks about the hired hand and the good shepherd.
约翰福音第10章说到雇工和牧羊人。
You know, when the wolf comes, the hired hand gives up on the sheep.
当狼来了的时候，雇工就舍弃了他的羊。
When disobedience comes, when wounds are inflicted, when frustration sets in, the hired hand gives up.
当羊不顺服或者受伤或者有挫败感的时候，雇工就会想要放弃。
But Jesus is the good shepherd who goes into the frustration and gives his life for us.
但是主耶稣却是那一位好牧人，即使有经历挫败，但是仍然愿意为他的羊舍弃生命。
The hired hand gives up on the sheep, but the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep.
雇工会舍弃他的羊，但是主耶稣这位好牧人，他是为羊舍弃他的生命。
there was a boy that I discipled for about 12 years, and then suddenly, I loved him, I cared for him. Suddenly, this boy sends me a message and saying some things that devastated me.
我有带领一位的门徒12年，一位的男孩12年的时间，但是有一天他突然寄了一个讯息给我说，让我非常的失望。
Saying things against me, like accusing.
就开始来到抨击我。
And I couldn't believe it that he taught these things.
那我不能够想象他教导这些的事
And I
情。
was so hurt that I thought maybe it's time that I distance myself from him a little bit.
我非常的受伤害，我就在想，我是不是要跟他保持距离？
And then I was studying this Good Shepherd.
但是我却看到了好牧人，
And I realized I cannot give up.
我就想到我不能够放弃。
And it was a time when he was building his home and he didn't have much help. So I thought I will go and spend 3 days with him from morning till night, helping him build.
所以他其实正在建造他自己的房子，那我就想，我就花3天的时间陪伴他，帮他一起来建房子。
Little by little, the bitterness went, the joy returned, and a greater oneness came between us.
那慢慢的，心中的苦毒就被散去呢，有喜乐在他的当中，我们就再一次和好。
The word for good shepherd is not the usual word, which is agathos in Greek. It's kalos, which means beautiful.
在这里，好牧人的原文不是 agathos， 是 kalos， 就是非常美好、美丽的。
Jesus is beautiful.
主耶稣是何等的荣美！
Oh, that we would be a beautiful generation that would embrace the frustration of steadfast commitment to the younger generation.
我们是一个美好的世代，我们是愿意承受挫败，我们愿意坚定服侍委身年轻的一代的。
We have to first exemplify it in our own lives,
我们必须要看看我们自己的生命，
perhaps by committing ourselves to the young leaders,
或者我们要委身在年轻的一代当中。
and then create a culture of steadfast love in our churches,
那我们会在教会当中有这种坚定爱的这个文
a
化，
culture of steadfast commitment to young people.
是有坚定委身服侍的一个文化。
That will result in an intergenerational oneness that will blaze new trails
这样-
for the gospel.
这样我们就会看到一个跨代的合一，能够开展新的福音的管道。
Thank you.